You're watching PowerNation. Today on Detroit Muscle, we dig into a piece of automotive history. And with the price tag on this one, it would take a second mortgage on the house to pay for it. Right now on Detroit Muscle. Hey guys, we're out and about on another driveway rescue. The vehicle we're going to be working on today isn't really something that you would just normally see sitting on the side of the street. To even see one of these that's the real thing in person is kind of a big deal.
So when we had an opportunity to pull this old car from its slumber, nurse it back to health, and get it back out on the highway, well, we jumped all over it. Oh, and if you want a hint of what it is, well, it's got a HEMI in it.
This car is a HEMI Cuda. It is one of 652 they built that year. And I've owned it for about 20 years, but it has been somewhat neglected. I stay pretty busy with the business, and it's just sat. It probably hasn't started in 10 years, and probably a lot of people will say, how can you have a HEMI Cuda and not drive it? But you know, you work all the time, that's the way it goes. It just needs getting up. It'll need probably the fuel tank cleaned and carburetors and stuff looked at and tuned and whatnot, and brakes checked, and need new tires put on it, stuff like that to get it roadworthy again. I'm looking forward to having it that way.
Not a bad trick.
I know, it's a short one, really. Woo, that's it.
Dude, that's a nice ride. Can't wait to drive it.
Yeah, me too.
Have you worked on one of these before?
I've worked on one or two.
Well, it's gonna be my first. Let's check this thing out.
Yeah.
You know, having an engine from fender well to fender well is pretty sweet.
Oh yeah, I like the shaker too.
Now, I'm sure we're gonna have to dive in on the ignition system and probably the fuel system and the brakes. What do you think?
I know, the brakes, they look probably like they haven't been any fluid in them in maybe 10, 15 years, and the carburetors probably haven't been cleaned out in at least that much.
Right. Now, we've got some aftermarket antique go-fast goodies on the distributor and coil. How hard do you think that's going to be to come up with?
Probably, if he's got an original distributor, that'd be the easiest thing to do, is just put points and condenser in it and go ahead and put it back in.
Yeah, I remember he said he had some stuff in the trunk. Let's see what
he's got.
Oh yeah, there's a couple pieces in here. There's a factory distributor, it looks like.
That's the original distributor.
And the carburetor, I guess he wants 3 of them.
No, he's got a spare for some reason. We'll find out later.
Yeah, let's get this thing loaded.
All right, sounds good.
Ready?
Oh yeah.
I'm pushing. Are you even pushing?
I'm pushing. Are you pushing?
This HEMI's gonna need quite a bit of tender loving care to get it back on its feet and standing tall like it once was. That's why we have our Rock Auto Driveway Rescue here in the shop.
Obviously, with this old Plymouth being such a high caliber vehicle, we wanted to give it some special attention. Now, after giving it the once over, we figured out, well, we've got our work cut out for us.
But I'm also hopeful that a small amount of some detective work will save us some labor. Now here on the fuel system, what we're wanting to do is make sure there's no rust and corrosion or even settlement in the tank, because as a car kind of sets out and hangs around for a little while, man, all that stuff seems to happen. Now we're going to be using a bore scope to slide down off in there to save us some work instead of having to drop the tank and then if everything checks out, putting it all back in there. Let's see what we got. At first glance, it doesn't look too bad. Normally with a car that's been sitting, there'll be that old cruddy stuff here on the neck. I rub on there, there's nothing on my finger. So we may be okay. Let's look a little deeper. Everything looks as it should. right there's the opening of the tank. Let's see what's in there. The floor of the tank looks nice. I don't see any rust. You guys just don't understand how excited I am to not have to pull the fuel tank out of this old Cuda. The state that we're in right now, we're ready to dump in some fuel. We will end up checking the rubber hoses that goes from the tank to the lines and the lines to the pump because we don't want any dry rot on those that could come back to bite us. Right now, it's time for us just to move on to the next task.
Up next, we dig into this old HEMI and break down the dual quads for some long overdue service.
Tackling a rare car like a HEMI Cuda can be, well, a stressful task. There's a lot that can go wrong in a shop, and one misstep can end up costing you a wad of cash. Take this shaker for instance. This is a 50-year-old piece. If you were to damage one of these, finding another one is not only tough, but expensive.
Now that's a sight to see. Those dual quads peeking through that shaker assembly makes me happy.
Don't drop it.
I ain't trying to. These carbs are extremely hard to find, so taking special care in the disassembly and rebuilding of these old HEMI feeders is essential for this Cuda to live up to its legacy.
Doing these driveway rescues give me a great deal of satisfaction because we get the joy of taking an old ride that's been sitting on the back burner or even in the backwoods and get it back out on the highway. We went to Rock Auto and got several components, and some of those you might not normally think about, and that would be the fluids, because we're gonna have to service that old HEMI. Now with that Mopar, finding parts for that thing can be a little bit difficult because of its rarity plus its age, but Rock Auto had plenty for us. We got several brake components because of the age of that thing and it's sitting. Well, whenever we have to get on the brakes, we want to make sure everything is nice and safe. We also got some tune-up components and some belts and hoses because I'm sure this stuff is all dry rotted. And then we got this box of goodies here and that one, which is where Daniel comes in. He's got a strong point on them carburetors. We're gonna let you get busy, son.
Well, I'm gonna do my best. You have fun with them brakes.
Man, you didn't have to rub it in.
While Tommy's over there elbows deep in those brakes, I'm gonna get started on these carburetors. Now, when a car's been sitting a long time, there's a couple things you need to look for when rebuilding the carburetors. One is missing parts. This carburetor's missing its choke and all its mechanisms. Second thing you want to look for are leaks, obviously like this one has right here. That's a result of dried out gaskets, which comes from age. The third thing you want to look for is shaft wear. A lot of times these carburetors, when they get a lot of age on them, some miles, the shafts get worn out. And the best way to tell if the shaft is worn out is when the carburetor is clean. So the first thing we want to do is get these things apart and get them in the tank. Now these aren't too tough to strip down. Having a couple of different screwdrivers and a pair of needle nose pliers will get the job done. Now they got the top off this old carburetor. I'm pleasantly surprised to see how clean this thing is for as long as the car has been sitting. There's some rust and some lacquer in there, but that's pretty typical, and all that comes out of the cleaning tank. The next thing to do is to finish tearing this thing down so we can get it all inspected and get it back together and get it on the car. Half, one, half, two, okay, that's right. One thing I like to do when I'm taking apart a carburetor, it was on a car that I've never heard run before, is to see where the mixture screws were and to give me some sort of a baseline for when I reassemble these things. This gives me an idea of what kind of shape the carburetor and engine was in. To finish disassembly on our carburetor, there are several components we need to remove. Things like the primary and secondary boosters, the air valve, and so on. Now, I've taken hundreds of these things apart, and it's easy for me to fly right through them. But here's a little tip for you. Now, a lot of times when you're taking these old carburetors apart, the main jets get stuck in the casting. Reason for that is because they're brass and they're in aluminum. What I do is I typically take a drift or like a grade 8 bolt, which I have here, and bump the top of them, which helps me get them out without damaging them. These get dunked in carburetor cleaner and soak for about 30 minutes.
Man, that thing turned out pretty nice.
Yeah, it looks good for a 50-year-old.
I don't mind age.
Oh, this thing's in good shape.
You need anything from me?
No, I'm good.
Let me get out of your way.
All right, buddy. Now, the first thing we want to do is check for shaft wear before we start putting the carburetor back together. In order to check this properly, what we want to do is hold the shaft open in about the idle position, wiggle it up and down. Now, you're looking for about 5 thousandths. Any more than that, and you've got excessive wear. Now, I built enough of these to know that this one's right in the sweet spot. Now, the next thing we want to do is check our idle feeds and bleeds for obstructions. Obstructions can cause tuning issues and operational problems. This is a really simple thing to do, and it doesn't require any special tools. Now, using a simple piece of welding wire, we can check this idle feed for blockages. 24 thousandths diameter is perfect because it's smaller than the orifices we're checking. From the looks of things, this one is clear. Now, this was the last one we had to check, and now I can put this thing back together.
Using a long piece of welding wire allows you to precisely drop your jets into place. Typically, you wouldn't lubricate your carburetor, but a little dab on these wear spots goes a long ways. Moving to the top plate, this is where the floats come into play. You have to set the float level and drop. This is crucial because it controls the amount of fuel that is stored inside the carburetor. Now on the exterior, there are several components as well. Obviously, the screws that attach the top plate to the main body, the accelerator pump rocker arm, and the pistons and metering rods. You know, Hoss, I have to say that could be the fastest carburetor rebuild I've seen.
Well, that's because I do a bunch of them.
How many you think you've done?
Oh, hundreds.
Hundreds,
Yeah,
really?
yeah.
Well, you still got one more to do.
I know, it ain't got as many parts in it as this one does, though.
Now, I sure hope you guys enjoyed that, and there is a lot of pieces to the inside of a carburetor, but it's kind of just nuts and bolts. Take it apart, pay attention, and you can put it back together. So how long do you think you're gonna do on that second one?
I think I can do it in about 4.5 minutes instead of 5.
Go.
All right.
Coming up, we're tackling the safety system on this 50-year-old relic. What we find after a long hibernation, next on Detroit Muscle. Well, we're well on our way working on our old HEMI Cuda. Now, just to take this old car, get the engine running, and try to drive it, well, it's a recipe for disaster without addressing the brakes. Out here on the back of this car, it's got a drum brake setup. A lot of modern mechanics haven't even ever worked on this type of stuff because it's such old school technology. And really and truthfully, when you get this drum off, well, it can look a little intimidating. It's because of all these small parts like the springs, cables, linkages, and such. This is your brakes. You want to make sure you do it correctly. But if you take your time, it's really not that much to it. Another thing that you want to pay attention to is leaks. Now, right now, ours is all dry, but that could have something to do with no one pushing the brake pedal in like 15 years. Now, what would age out is this wheel cylinder. What happens is you apply fluid pressure. It causes the drums to expand, creating drag on the drum, and the car stops. Now, our shoes look like they're okay, but we might as well replace them since we're in here. We'll start off by removing the upper springs, then move on to our self-adjuster cable. Then a few more clips, and this thing is stripped down to the backing plate. Ooh, that's bad shape right there. We're ready to remove this wheel cylinder. It's got a couple of bolts and a tube that feeds it here on the back that's exposed to the elements. I like to spray them with some lubricant like Seafoam's Deep Creep. A little bit of slickum on that line will go a long ways because rust and corrosion gets built up between the line and the tube, and we don't want to damage anything. That thing come out a lot easier than I was anticipating, but let me show you the sins that this thing's got on it. Peeling this little rubber piece off here, you can see all that nastiness. assuming we would have not touched the brakes and tried to drive this car, if the master cylinder would have moved any fluid, either the brakes would not have worked at all, or if it pushed the piston out, all that debris would have locked it up and not allowed it to return, causing the brakes to continue to hold. To get started on reassembly, we're gonna give the backing plate a quick squirt of some cleaner, scrub it down with a brush, then wash away all that grime. The wheel cylinder goes in first, followed by the links. With it all greased up, the tedious task of shoe assembly can start. If you're concerned about this, don't give up. You got this. And there's nothing wrong with taking a couple of photos to use as a reference. But if you get ahead of yourself, an online search can help you find the same information. Just remember, you gotta put all the pieces back in the same place they came from, and you don't want any pieces left over.
Up next, woo, we get this old HEMI up and running.
And boy, does this elephant motor sound like a stampede. Hey guys, welcome back. We're finishing up the final details on our Rock Auto Driveway Rescue 1970 Plymouth HEMI Cuda. Now this old thing hasn't started up in 15 plus years, and we're just moments away to hearing what this thing sounds like. Daniel, you think it's gonna go pretty smooth?
Oh yeah, buddy, this is the easy part. We just need some fresh gas and a little bit of fire and she'll crank right up.
Man, if it goes that easy, well, we'll be sitting sweet. But to get to this point, well, it's been kind of a journey. Laying underneath that killer shaker was a set of dual quads. You could say that they were needing some loving for sure. And after Daniel worked his magic, our HEMI was one step closer to full throttle.
Tackling the brakes was a necessity to make this car safe for the road. So when you're working on old rides that have been sitting on the back burner, you need to be prepared to get dirty.
Under the hood, the first thing we tackled was the cooling system. This antique thermostat had to go, then we swapped on a couple of new hoses.
Next, we had to dig a little deeper and swap out that old crusty fuel pump. This is always a good idea because if the diaphragm goes bad, you'll be pumping fuel into the crankcase, resulting in a disaster.
To say this thing needed a belt is an understatement. Just check the old one out. It retained its shape, as if it was still mounted on the car.
Next, it was time for a tune-up. The owner told us that when he last drove the old HEMI, that the ignition system was giving him a fit. And since all this stuff had to come apart so we could prime the old 426, it made repairing the ignition issues that much easier.
With the ignition system needing some attention, we pulled the plugs.
It's not burning hot enough, it's really caked up with carbon.
And I have to say, a plug swap on this old girl has to be the easiest job ever. While Daniel polished off the electrical system, I got to work bleeding the new brakes we installed. How I got stuck with this job, I don't know.
Well, you drew the short straw on this one there, cuz. It's now time to put the cherry on top. These dual quads were all we needed to put the rumble back in this old HEMI.
With all the hard work done, we're pretty much ready to dump fuel in the back, fire it up. Can you think of anything else?
Not right offhand, but if we're forgetting anything, the car will let us know here in a minute.
Don't speak like that, brother.
Oh, you'll be fine.
Slide in on here.
All right, spin this thing over.
Man, this car fits.
Well, that's pretty good. Give us more gas.
You can tell a Mopar's only designed to start once because it takes so long for that starter.
That's right.
Here we go.
All right, buddy. Hang on a minute. I'm gonna lower the time and see if that helps it any. Okay. Yeah.
Man, I thought she was going.
Let's let it sit for a minute, cool off.
Okay. You gonna give it one more again?
Yeah, buddy. Let's try it one more time.
I think this is gonna be the one.
Woo!
I have to say, by the sounds of this thing, I see why people were buying Mopars back in the day.
Ain't no doubt, buddy. It sounds great.
I think it's about time to stretch the legs on this old thing and get it out on the highway.
Well, let's put the shaker on and take a trip.
Getting to work on this old school HEMI is definitely a great day at the office. And getting to sit behind the wheel, well, takes it to a whole nother level. This isn't the last time you're gonna get to see this piece of Detroit muscle.